Let me say good evening and welcome to this International Center for Moral Injury webinar. My name, as most of you will know, is Brian Powers. I'm the inaugural Bernard William Vann Fellow in Christianity and the Military here at Durham University, as well as the Executive Director of the ICMI. And I'm so glad that each of you has joined us tonight, as I'm delighted to welcome Leo Quinlan, Marty O'Connor, and Michael Lyons, the founders of Moral Injury International, for a conversation around moral injury and its impacts on the families of those experiencing it. Now, as you'll likely know, the International Center for Moral Injury is committed to producing and receiving new scholarship on moral injury, facilitating new research by building networks of academic scholars, military members, chaplains, clergy, and others with knowledge of and experience with moral injury. The ICMI seeks to create and develop resources for pastoral counselors, caregivers, churches, and faith organizations caring for morally injured individuals. And each of these things serves the center's ultimate goal of increasing an understanding of the causes and impacts of moral injury and facilitating increased care for those experiencing it. This webinar is part of our larger monthly webinar program, which seeks to fulfill at least one aspect of those larger aims through building resources for those caring for morally injured individuals. We'll be recording tonight's webinar, and you can find recordings of nearly all of our past webinars on our YouTube channel. Just as a final note, I want to acknowledge what could be a difficult aspect about the particular content of tonight's webinar up front. You will hear, particularly, I think, in the narratives of Marty and Leo, and throughout the conversation itself, details about the experience of having a parent who is impacted by moral injury. Many of us here tonight, myself included, may be processing our own experiences at MI while raising children. And as such, we may recognize actions or behaviors named as similar to our own. And this recognition may bring about renewed feelings of guilt and shame. They may recall times when perhaps we wish we'd acted differently, been more patient, available, or otherwise present. And if in hearing this tonight, or in viewing it later, our conversation triggers this experience, please be reminded of a couple things. One, that moral injury itself is a marker of the good conscience, seeking a way to understand our own actions in a complex world. You're not alone, and if you do feel overwhelmed, please know that help is available. Jane is posting in the chat now several organizations in the US, in the UK, and Australia that you may contact. Please also know that each of us on this webinar this evening has dedicated a significant and particular portion of our lives, not to shaming those who experience MI, but working towards pathways to greater understanding, to recovery, to solace, and to reconciliation. And our intent this evening is certainly not to shame each other, but to facilitate those healing aims in a hopeful way. So without further ado, let me turn to introduce our speakers for this evening. Leo Quinlan, Marty O'Connor, and Michael Lyons, as I noted earlier, are the three co-founders of Moral Injury International, an organization whose mission is to educate others in defining, understanding, and overcoming moral injury. Leo is a former commandant in the Irish Army and son of Colonel Pat Quinlan, who as a commandant led the Irish troops in the siege of Jadotville in the Congo in 1961. Leo was 16 at the time of the events, and after a career in the Irish Army himself, went on to co-author the book Heroes of Jadotville, the soldier story, and speak to international audiences about the battle and about moral injury. Marty O'Connor is an Irish mental health advocate now based in Australia. Marty grew up on an army base in Ireland, and his father Tom O'Connor served in the same battle as Leo's as part of 21 years service in the Irish Army. Like many veterans, Tom struggled greatly with his mental health in subsequent years. Marty identifies the cause as moral injury and speaks openly about the effect moral injury had on his family and what's brought healing, providing a voice to people around the world who've been affected by moral injury. Michael Lyons served in the Irish Army from 1960 to 1966, and later was a hospital and hospice lay chaplain for 10 years. He was also a founding member of the Irish Support Agency, Sydney Irish Welfare Bureau, and a founding director of Ireland Australia International, Incorporated. With experience in the field of drug and alcohol abuse, phone counseling, and suicide prevention, he's now a welfare officer for the New South Wales Return Services League. So it's my honor to welcome each of them tonight. And I'll first turn to Leo and just ask him to perhaps offer a bit more of a comprehensive introduction, and then turn to Marty and Michael in turn. So Leo, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very, very much indeed. Well, you've heard who I am and how did I get involved with moral injury. Well, I have to go back to the United States in January 2021 when I was interacting with U.S. Army War College, where I was presenting the story of the Siege of Jadotville, as was mentioned in the Congo in 1961. But also, while I was speaking to the U.S. Army War College, I interacted with U.S. Army Veterans Associations. And when they heard the story of Jadotville and the aftermath of it, they came up immediately with the phrase collective moral injury. They said that Jadotville is the perfect example of collective moral injury. Now, as I've often said, all of a sudden the penny dropped with me when they spoke about what is moral injury. I brought the term moral injury, I think I brought the term moral injury into Ireland for the first time in January of 2021. And putting it in layman terms with the military context, the way we explain it in our podcast, what is moral injury? In a military sense, we say that it's where soldiers suffer some traumatic experience and are then betrayed by higher authority. Now, this is Jadotville in a nutshell. This is exactly what happened. And then because they were, let's say, denied, because they were ignored, because there was no duty of care to them when they came back from Jadotville. And these were young boys, 2 of them 15, 12 of them 16 years of age. And the average age of the rest was 18 and a half years old. When they came back from this battle and being ignored, then what we considered to be moral injury set in. They started feeling ashamed. They started feeling they'd done something wrong. They became silent. They withdrew into themselves. The typical effects, as we now know, of moral injury were broken relationships, difficulty to maintain a job, alcoholism, mental problems, and depression, and unfortunately suicide. So that's what happened in the case of 5 of the men of Jadotville committing suicide. And Marty will tell you more about one of them. He was 16 years of age in Jadotville. Did something extraordinarily brave, very efficient soldier at the age of 16, and was denied his promotion, denied a medal that he was recommended for, immigrated to Australia, and took his own life in Australia later on. So how did then moral injury, let's say that when I heard about it, how did that get into Australia? Well, as you've been told, Marty and I have the distinction of being sons of 2 Jadotville veterans. My dad was the commandant or major in charge of the company of 155 men. Marty's father was commander of an armored car, which was one of 2 armored cars, which provided the, let's say, mobile reserve within the perimeter defense. And as such was in the thick of the action for 5 days non-stop. And must have seen some terrible things and did some terrible damage to the enemy. For those of you who don't know, basically it was 155 Irishmen against 3,500 enemy. Katangese paratroopers led by mercenaries from about 5 different armies, veterans of the Second World War, Korean War, and so on. Vastly outnumbered, and yet the Irish lost nobody. 5 wounded. The enemy had 300 dead lying all around the Irish trenches and 750 wounded. I have seen letters from sons when they're prisoners of war writing to the mothers in Ireland, talking about all the bodies around the trenches with arms and legs missing and so on. This had a terrible effect on 15, 16, 17-year-old boys, not even men, boys. Anyway, I met Marty and then Captain Wally Jensen, United States Navy retired chaplain, and then Michael Lyons, as you've just been introduced to. And from that came Moral Injury Australia, and then that morphed into what is now Moral Injury International. Marty will explain more about that. We are, as you've said earlier, we're trying to advance the understanding of moral injury. What is moral injury? We're trying to educate people about where moral injury exists. And as rightly said already, it's in every walk of life. And we have interviewed people from many walks of life. My personal experience of moral injury, let's say my father was a very strong man, physically strong, mentally strong, highly educated. He was good at his job. He brought home everybody alive. It had an effect on him. The deaths, because he was out there to keep the peace. And one aspect of moral injury is when, in the case of soldiers, when you ask them to do something that goes against their moral upbringing, their religious upbringing, and their environmental upbringing. So going out killing young Africans, as to were young boys and young men, went against all of that. If it would be a different situation if they were fighting for Ireland or defending Ireland. But out keeping the peace, they ended up killing. This went against the grain. This had an effect on my dad. I know this for a fact. In the battle, he killed 2 men. He told me about how he did it. He had to do it. It didn't sit easy with him. And after he shot the 2 men, he crawled along the trenches and he went to his chaplain and he said, Father Joe Fagan, he says, Joe, I'm after killing 2 men. I shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be killing anybody here. We're supposed to be keeping the peace. And Joe gave him what he called a metaphorical slap across the face. And he said, Pat, you go back and do what you have to do, or we're not going to get out of here alive. So my dad told me he lost it for 2 or 3 minutes and then became a professional soldier again. But 2 years before he passed away at the age of 78, 22 years ago, thereabouts, he said to my younger brother, the only thing I regret about Jadotville is those 2 men I murdered. Not killed in battle or anything, or not that I murdered, because it was always weighing on his mind that he killed 2 people that he shouldn't have had to kill. And my dad was religious. All the Irish were Catholics out there before the battle started, and every day during the battle they would get blessed by the chaplain, the priest was with them, and going from trench to trench. It's that kind of an environment. And it was in the days, 1960s, when all Irish families would be kneeling down, saying prayers at night before they go to bed together. So this was going against their religious upbringing as well. Further, how it affected my father, he went silent about it. He didn't talk much about the battle itself until later, when I became an Army Ranger and I became a captain and I kind of proved myself. And so he started telling me the tactical things. Never told me the downside of it, the moral injury side of it, or the sad side of it. But later on, when he was getting a good bit older, I'm older than he now than he was when he passed away, but okay, he was old to me at the time. He would withdraw further into himself, wouldn't discuss it too much. And this is a classic thing about moral injury. They don't talk, they hide it. As a result of me getting to know moral injury from the US war veterans, as I mentioned, I began to interact more with the veterans themselves here in Jadotville that live in Ireland. There are about 35 or 36 still living, and I interact fairly closely with about 9 of them. And when I mentioned moral injury, all of a sudden the penny dropped with them. One of them said, "Oh my God, now I understand. That's what happened to me. I didn't realize this. Oh, now I can understand myself a bit better." Or a woman who's my age, she said, that's why my father never spoke when he came home. He used to go down to the shed in the back garden and smoke on his own for hours, not talking to anybody. Oh, that's why my father never gave me a hug or a kiss after we came back from Jadotville. One Jadotville veteran who absolutely idolizes his wife, both still alive, he said, after Jadotville, I could never use the word love. It just didn't come easy to me after all the killing. 2 veterans ended up in mental homes. One veteran from Jadotville who only died last year was an Army Ranger with me. We went through the same Ranger course. Later on, when I was a commander of a Ranger company, he was one of my Rangers, and a fantastic sergeant he was. He had left the Army for about 8 years before I discovered he had been in Jadotville. And we shared poncho tents. We knew each other for about 12 years, and he never said he was in Jadotville. They wanted to hide everything. So you had that kind of situation. And then, just almost finishing, just to talk about the effects in families, it just doesn't stop with the veterans. It goes into their children and their children's children. And I've seen it, I've heard it, I've heard them talking about it. The sisters of one man who took his own life, and their children talking about it. And there's a nice side to it as well, as Marty and I calculated, about, if you look at positivity, the positive side of them coming home. 155 Irishmen coming home. The families they had, the children and the grandchildren they've had. There are about 10,000 people living in Ireland and Australia and 1 or 2 other places who are alive now because they all came home. And what gave me a bit of a lift a few years ago, nothing necessarily to do with moral injury, but it's just a nice ending, what I'm going to say. I was at a function, a Jadotville function in the middle of Ireland, a place called Athlone, about a year ago, when this young man of about 18 came up and said, "Sir, do you mind if I have my photograph taken with you?" I said, "Absolutely. But why?" He says, "I just want to have this photograph because if your if your father had not brought my grandfather home, I would never have been born." So that's just a nice side of it. I just wanted to finish on that bit. So Marty now will tell you an awful lot more, followed by Michael. I'm open to questions anytime. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leo. Excellent. I love that introductory. I'm speaking about transgenerational. I grew up on the Curragh camp, which is not a camp. It has houses, all of that. I grew up on the Curragh camp, and I didn't know because I wasn't born when my dad was in the Battle of Jadotville. But my mom absolutely adored him. And then I found out through moral injury and my family, there's 6 of us siblings, and found out through Leo and everything what moral injury was. And it gave me great satisfaction because my dad was and I'm not going to go into details, my dad was a very, very violent man in all extremes. And then my mom, God love her, she tried to commit attempted murder suicides on us 6 times that we recall. And it was because she said, and I asked her before she passed away, she decided to depart. I said, what? Like, she said, I loved him, absolutely loved him. But after the first time that he came back, she said, they sent the wrong man home. And after that, things progressed with violence. Now, my dad was certainly a war hero. No ifs or buts about that, as Leo said. And he served 3 tours in Congo and 5 tours in Cyprus. But they brought war home to us. And as kids, and I have to say this with transgenerational moral injury, you look up, I loved my dad. But then when you see your dad that you look up to, that's moral injury. You're let down when you see him beat up your siblings or beat up your mom. As I say, is I actually enjoyed my dad beating me up because it wasn't painful. You watch your mom or your siblings get beat up, that's where it hurts. But going into it, my dad, he was bad, but he suffered from moral injury because he was let down, and it's a ripple effect that goes all the way down. And I understand it, but learning from Leo and Wally and Michael and Leo are my mentors, and understand it. I actually forgive him. I mean, my mom attempted 6 attempted murder suicides on us children. She tried to gas us. She tried to drown us. Because God love her, she didn't do it because she just didn't know what to do. She had no idea because he was let down from the army. He came back after Jadotville, was a coward. Even though he went back overseas, he finished off with, as I said, with 21 years service he did. We thought then after 21 years service, then my mom said, we'll move out of the Curragh camp because I was born on the Curragh Military Hospital. We said, she goes, things will change, but things never changed. My dad was just very violent. We suffered everything. And my mom, marginal rape, that she suffered as well. And that's what I just learned. And then when I learned it with my family, learned about moral injury, I went, you know what? I actually understand now. He was damaged. They should never have sent that man home to us. There was no duty of care. They should never have sent him back into that house, which caused my mom to as we used to always laugh and go, God, did she try to kill us because we were just 6 little effers? But it wasn't. She wanted to protect us, but she had no other way out, And that's that's I'm transgenerational moral injury because it goes down through all effects. I have, 5 children, and we talk about it, and that has affected them because it affected myself and my family. But with moral injury, since I learned that, it's given me complete understanding, forgiveness, and closure. I would have, before my dad died, I couldn't imagine. I have 5 children. I couldn't imagine my dad when he was dying and not having any of his children around him. I mean, I think that would be terrible, but yet I carry that guilt for not being there. If that was years ago, and as Leo said earlier about it's Matt Quinlan that committed suicide in Queensland. He was actually a real hero, not just in the battle. He saved 2 Aboriginal children. He lived on it, and then at the age of 48, he blew his head off. He couldn't handle it anymore because the past caught up with him. Now, I'm going to hand it over now. I think I've done enough talking there. That's my time up.
Thank you, Marty. Yes, Michael, let's turn to you, please, for a moment.
Yes, thank you. And I'm delighted to be here from sunny Sydney. I'd like to share with you my observations on the subject of moral injury based on my own roughly 17 to 20 years experience and evidence-based outcomes, providing emotional, spiritual, religious support through hospital chaplaincy, also suicide prevention programs, and in the field of drug and alcohol abuse. I also advocate for the Defence Forces here in Australia, and I'm a welfare officer for a return services club in Sydney. So first of all, a quick summary, and then I'd like to conclude by talking about what do we do now that we've learned about this scourge and we better understand it. What are we doing about it, or what can we do about it to help people not suffer in silence? That's the heading. Don't let people suffer in silence. So first of all, a quick summary. Moral injury is not a medical or a mental condition, and it is not a precise science like diagnosing PTSD. So our understanding is still relatively new. However, as lay people, I'm convinced that we can assist and have a positive impact on those who may suffer from the condition, or at least refer them to someone who can. Again, don't let them suffer in silence. And there's various ways of describing moral injury in the military sense or any other sense, but moral injury occurs when a person perpetrates, witnesses, or fails to prevent an act of behavior that violates their own sense of morality. When do you do something that you know is bad or fail to prevent it happening? Now, we all have a conscience or a moral compass. We have a soul and a conscience, and we commit an act that violates that, we can suffer from this condition known as moral injury. It is associated predominantly with the military, and it was popularized during the Vietnam War when the troops coming home were treated for post-traumatic stress. An American clinical psychologist, Dr. Jonathan Shea, was one of the first to acknowledge that moral injury was not a mental condition. His expression was, it's the betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority, especially in a high-stakes situation. And as Leo said, in this Irish situation in Jadotville, that's a kind of what did happen. So now that the fallout from committing or failing to prevent a bad act, as mentioned previously, is compounded when it contains a betrayal. It makes it a lot worse. This is exactly what happened to the Irish and UN peacekeeping forces following their part in the Battle of Jadotville in '61, and indeed also the American Vietnam War troops coming home after we all read about the betrayal through America on the Vietnam War through the Pentagon Papers. Not going into that, but it became obvious then that there was troops sent into a war that was never winnable, and the fallout was 50,000 actually killed Americans during the Vietnam War, and there was 500 Australians. And again, they were in a war they shouldn't have been in. So this ripples down, and mothers and fathers think about sending their kids out to a war that they should have never been in. So how do we recognize moral injury? Well, those with a moral injury usually go silent. That's one thing they do. They go silent. They don't want to talk about it because they're ashamed and they feel guilty. They believe that they are bad people, and they can go into depression, feel suicidal, which many do. Again, as noted in the Jadotville, after Jadotville, alcohol and drug abuse, the relationship breaks down. They're not active anymore, and they're just to name a few symptoms. Now, of course, these behaviors can exist in other conditions such as PTSD. I believe that there's a crossover between moral injury and PTSD. In fact, they can probably coexist. But the constant in moral injury is silence, shame, and guilt. And that causes emotional pain that goes to the heart and soul of the person. It's emotional, and is very rarely successfully treated by medications or therapies adopted when, we'll say, treating mental illness. So the cause, what causes this moral injury? And again, if we think back to Leo's father in Jadotville, who went to the Padre after killing two people, two of the enemy, Pat Quinlan knew he had done something bad. He had committed an act that completely went against his moral code, even though it was in the heat of battle. Pat Quinlan was a committed Catholic and informed by Christian faith that tells us the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. In the later years, as Leo said, the fact that he confessed to his son that he had murdered somebody gives you an idea of what he carried all his life probably and was never resolved. So why would someone not be affected by that if there was no resolution to it in the beginning? And going back then, I suggest to you in Ireland, moral injury would not have been on the radar for people coming back for debriefing and that. And of course, this is what he experienced by killing two people. This was compounded then when he went back to Ireland, and the UN higher authorities and the Irish government, they were betrayed by the government as well of Ireland and the UN. So it was a double whammy, as they say, for the troops of Jadotville. That's why they have suffered so much over the years, and they've suffered in silence, which is an awful situation. So the question is, how as a community, how do we assist someone with moral injury? If you have a family member or friend and you feel they fit into the moral injury category, please encourage them to get help. Don't have them suffer in silence. There are many professional organizations available and a number of support groups that can be referred to. However, my lived experience and evidence informs me that we as a community can often be more effective in the healing process with moral injury, more so than a professional sometimes. I'm not suggesting you don't go to professionals, but it can happen in the community probably more effectively. Again, quoting from Jonathan Shea, who said, recovery happens in the community. Peers are the key to recovery. Veterans themselves heal each other. And this is what my own experience as a welfare officer for returned soldiers, I have experienced this talking in small groups, and we've done a lot of good work there. So as a layperson, don't feel you are not qualified to help. Form a group of like-minded people. Don't pressure yourself into thinking you have to fix things or fix the problem. We are not fixers. First of all, form a relationship with the person. Show them that you can be trusted, and create a safe and sacred space that they can enter into and discuss with you what their issues are. You know, the greatest gift we can give to someone that's in the dark place is to listen to the story without judging or criticizing, and to be able to hold their pain and share their pain empowers them tremendously if they can see, and they can see the story differently, and that can have where the healing can start. My brother was a Catholic priest in London, and he did a lot on this. Unfortunately, he passed away, a young man. But he sent me a paper one time, and he said from his own situation, I have discovered that one of my strengths is my capacity to hold a person's story in such a way that they too hear it in a new way. I've had the privilege of seeing profound transformation taking place when such a personal story is held in the reassuring and accepting embrace of a wounded healer. That's what it's about, the story. It's all about the story. And when I used to talk to him during my chaplaincy days myself, I was a lay chaplain, he'd say, Michael, it's all about the story. Listen, if you listen to it, you'll hear it, it'll come out. Can I also say, if you're confronted by unpleasant stories, it's okay. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. We're all different. But at least refer them to somebody else if you feel you're out of your depth here, that you feel the pain is just too much for you to gather, because you do hear some horrific stories when you talk to people and listen to people actively. Be comfortable with moments of silence. It's often in the silence that the healing occurs. That sacred time when nothing is being said, but things happen. Be comfortable with moments of silence. Ask them if they feel guilty, if they feel ashamed, do they feel suicidal? It's okay to ask that. At one time they say, oh, don't talk about suicide. It's okay, ask them. Do they feel like they're bad people, or have them own what's happened, have them own what's violated their moral compass. In fact, bad people do bad things. Also, people do bad things. So good people do bad things. Doesn't mean they're all bad. I believe that there are two parts to this situation. If we go back to Pat Quinlan, he was a professional soldier, and like all other soldiers, he understood the possibility of being sent into combat, and a killing, it could be part of that conflict. When Commandant Quinlan made a decision to kill two of the enemy, that's what he was trained to do. But I believe at that point he suppressed the side of him that was caring and the
Michael,
empathy
can we get some questions in here from the audience, please?
Yes, sure, yeah.
Marty, I was going to come over to back to you. Something you said really struck me. I think it seemed like you were talking about kind of the cascading effects of betrayal, almost, that there's a betrayal in the duty of care for your father, and the way he was just kind of came back without any help, without any particular care for what he was going through, and then that kind of cascaded into your own family. But it struck me as just spectacular about how you're able to talk about that so freely and openly in this, and clearly talked about having conversations with your own children. And it seems like in that you have managed to quite effectively kind of break this cycle of cascading betrayals. Does that resonate with kind of your experience of it? And if so, how would you express how you've kind of broken that cycle of cascading betrayal?
Well, I suppose the fact is I've got my sister or my family is because when my dad and my mom, and I don't mean to put this in any rude way, I've got respect for both of them, is my mom was trying to kill us and my dad was trying to kill her and then beating us up. But I learned that there must be something there, because I lived on with my dad for years after he was removed. But I think was the basic thing is she always said, as I repeated earlier, is she said she didn't know who, they sent the wrong man home, but we never knew who was coming in the front door. But to be honest and my sister, my family said is we had to be the parents because we actually didn't have parents. We had to.
Mm.
So that's where the more we understood that we had to be the parents, because and all we were doing was we were stand-in parents. We had no idea, but we grew up too fast. And that's what I mean by moral injury. That man was let down. If he'd have come back like Matt Quinlan that committed suicide, and I think there was 10% of the men. Now the suicide, and I use suicide very. My mum, she tried to gas us, she tried to drown us. God love her. I can put it like this: she was a great cook and a great singer, and thank God she was hopeless at trying to kill us. So we kind of benefit from that. But the thing is, when my dad was away, she was a very happy woman. But when he came back, he brought war home to us. And the violence was absolutely horrendous. But yet, from lone moral injury, I understand now. And I actually forgive him. I don't condone it, but I forgive him, which has given myself closure and my family.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm. And when you said you talk to your own children, do you have open conversations just about?
Well, obviously, you know, you were on my podcast.
Yeah.
My children, and I have 3 ex-wives and 5 children. 2 more, and I'm done. I'm telling you that. But they're all my absolutely. They're my great, beautiful friends, and they understand it because they realize. And if I can just put that in, what I say, transgenerational. I'm one generation past from my dad and what we went through, but then the effects have continued on. We've all had our issues, and also I joke about I had 3 ex-wives and 5, but as Leo said eloquently, part of moral injury is no commitment. So I had it through transgeneration. I was just lucky that I had all of my ex-wives, but I could never make commitment. That's why I moved around. You know, it's like when my daughter was born, she was born in London. Jordan, my best friend, she was born in London. I went to the States. I left her for 4 months. You know why? I thought I would be like my dad. I thought maybe I'd beat her up. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Wow. No, thank you, Marty.
Welcome.
And certainly, for Leo and Michael, jump in if you want on some of these things, or there's something you'd like to note. Leo, you kind of what we see here in some sense are 2 different kind of methods of dealing with moral injury in between what you've described and what Marty's described growing up. In kind of the options seem to be either kind of retreating into silence and a lot of isolation, contemplation, or often very outwardly exploding that into different forms of violence towards those around you. And it seems like in a family dynamic, there's often one of those 2 kinds of options and operating in a spectrum in between. Is there, and kind of Michael, certainly some things you hit on, is there a point in there that's a happy medium of expression that we might think is really helpful? And kind of you spoke, Michael, a little bit about how we get there, but what does that look like? I feel like we talk about that a lot, but it's difficult to kind of recognize and embody kind of how those conversations might look.
Michael, do you want to take this?
Well, yes, and that's a very good point. But it's something that kind of evolves. If you know somebody or you recognize, and if I go back 17 years ago, I was working in a situation where I was dealing with people with lots of trauma and different difficulties in a major hospital. I didn't know anything about moral injury, but when I reflect back now, I was in the middle of a moral injury, and I couldn't put my finger on it. And a lot of people I was with then, because I'm not trained they were referred to a clinical psychologist and all that. But when I think back now, and I've noted a lot of people I've dealt with, they did have a moral injury, and it develops. If you meet, you don't put it on them. It's like if you got a friend who you think has suddenly changed. He used to go to the club once a week. Now they don't go anymore, once a month. and you feel that they've changed in their behavior and all that, and there's something going on, I wouldn't be too inclined to say, what's wrong with you? You know, you just befriend them, be friendly with them and say, oh, no, I noticed that you weren't here last week. How are things going? And if they don't give you an answer, oh, they'll usually say, oh, it's okay. But then maybe the next week and the week after, when they feel safe with you, when people feel safe with you and they can enter into this space with you, then you will find things will evolve without even asking. And a story that's not solicited has a lot more meaning than a story that is solicited. So my answer, Brian, I suppose, is you've got to be careful where you're going, and but you've got to develop a relationship. It's all about relationships and feeling safe.
Leo.
Can I jump in, Brian?
Please.
I've seen with my father, and I've seen with other, maybe 9 or 10 of the Jadotville veterans and their families. Let's say 8 or 9 of us. There are 8 or 9 different reactions in the families. It affects different people in different way. Moral injury, like Marty's, is an extreme case. In my case with my dad, we didn't have any problems other than, hey, he's gone a bit silent, or near the end of his life, he was taking a few drinks too many. But he never was violent or anything like that. He was always a fabulous father, fabulous husband. Love just oozed out of him, and so on. So I've been very, very lucky when I hear Marty's story and other people's stories. But there's no doubt about it that when we became aware of moral injury 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, thereabouts, my brothers and my sister and I, we discussed it. And sure enough, then we could reflect back to how my father must have held moral injury inside him all the time, eating away at him for years and years and years. He never pushed it over on us or on my mother in any way, shape, or form, except maybe a few drinks too many near the end. But even then, it was not in any bad way, if you know what I mean. So I have seen it from that point of view, where he was such a strong man, he held it within himself. But something just cropped up in my mind as we were talking there. I said about veterans healing each other and so on. I think it was you that said it. Then about healing, there was a, I think that we have, if I've not been too prideful, Marty, Michael, and I think we've helped a few people over the last couple of years because they've told us so. And I won't mention names, but one of the men from Jadotville, he was aged 18 in Jadotville. 2 years later, he took his own life in London. His younger brother of 10 years of age read about his brother's suicide in an English tabloid paper. That's how he heard about his brother going into suicide. That 10-year-old is now in his 60s and a very, very disturbed man, until he started talking to us maybe 6 or 8 months ago. And as he's told us a few times, all of a sudden he's transformed. He understands what his brother went through. He understands moral injury. He's taken comfort of it. Marty talks about closure and understanding. So we feel a little bit chuffed is the word, I suppose, or satisfied that at least we can point to one person that has benefited from what we're trying to do, as Michael has been saying, by understanding it. And by understanding it, he has come to forgive, get closure, and heal himself. And we're not experts in this thing. We're just trying to raise awareness and understanding that moral injury exists and what we think it is.
No, thank you. I mean, everyone, for that. It seems like there's certainly a key that I think a common thing between both Moral Injury International and the wonderful work that you've done, and certainly what we're trying to do with the ICMI, that idea of understanding seems to be a huge key that unlocks a lot of our capacities
Brian,
to be empathetic.
Brian, may I just say there, following up on Leo, there is, I've learned, because there's 6 in our family, is I think there's moral injury, there's certain degrees. Some are affected in some ways, some it doesn't affect some, and then the ones that live in silence, it affects them more. Sorry, I just wanted to throw that in. I beg your pardon.
No, that's really helpful, because it's funny. We walk into this after, in one sense, me and my relatively serene family, but kind of trying to mediate a solution to a World War III that breaks out between my own boys and walking in here. That the key to that is similar to this idea of understanding and how perhaps difficult that can be, particularly within families, even to achieve, certainly in those moments. That's something we're trying to work at even at the best of times, and saying, hey, guys, if we can just understand this viewpoint for half a second, if we can just take half a breath to understand this, it seems like there is something of a lived experience, perhaps, and we come to an understanding of that through our own lives and through our own kind of trials and tribulations and our own experiences of betrayal and our own experiences, perhaps, of even harming others, that in that there's some capacity that we gain from that. And I say that kind of as a lead-in, Marty, to a question we've got brought up that I'll put to you. You speak of forgiveness in that it seems like that level of understanding does enable perhaps this capacity for forgiveness. Can you speak perhaps about how helpful that was to you within your family, kind of those two links perhaps?
Well, I will. I go back to it from I learned with moral injury, and this only gone back 3 years ago. And then Michael Lyons, and Michael had his own tragedy with his son, and we spoke about that. And I found with my family, by us talking, because no one ever brought it up, it was always swept under the carpet, if you want to use that word. You didn't speak. As my mom said to us, don't ever tell anyone about your dad beating us up or doing anything like that. And it was always hidden. And then I realized with learning moral injury, it was just amazing. And then it's like telling someone else. And when I explained it to my family and everything, and then got presented with my dad's medals, no one wanted anything to do with my dad, not in the least whatsoever. But it gave me more satisfaction, because even after my dad, I lived with him for 10 years, but kept it secret from my family, because they wouldn't allow that. They'd never spoke to him. But yet I thought, I must have known something. I didn't know what it was. And then when moral injury came along, it just gave me and my family, we're actually proud of him now. And which is a weird thing to say. He beat us up. He was a very violent. He drowned my dog. He beat my mom severely. Like, there's no ifs or buts. My sister, as I said, I'd enjoy him beating me up because it was easy. But I learned then with moral injury is not forgiveness, understanding. But then I got to realize through moral injury, he was damaged. He was actually damaged. They should never have sent the man home, as my mum said. So, yeah, sorry if that answers your question.
No, it's quite helpful, because I think it brings up a really interesting dynamic in just the relationships you've named. And I wonder if there's, particularly within families, when particular violence and trauma occurs within those families, if there's boundaries in there that you have to navigate in dealing with this, between accountability and forgiveness, between some notion of acknowledgement and
Yeah, we understand it, but it's actually, which it sounds weird, Brian, is it's actually brought our family closer to understanding, as in we've always been a close family, but it actually brings us closer because we're able to talk about this stuff. Like we joke about my mom, and we go, she tried to gas us one time, and we always laugh because my older brother turned off the gas. So we joke and we go, anything goes wrong, we joke with him, we go, it's your fault you turned off the gas. Do you know what I mean? You have to take take the humor out of it. But at the end of the day, it wasn't. It was simply moral injury. My dad was let down from the army. I wasn't born in 1961. My mom was pregnant with my sister, my older sister. But when he came back, I'm going back again, repeating myself, they sent the wrong man home, and we never knew who was coming in the door. And I feel sorry for my mom, what she went through, but I don't blame him now. And I don't blame my mom, as we joke and we go, all the family go, one just tried to beat us up, tried to kill my mom. Then my mom's trying to kill us, and we're trying to kill him. It was like a triangle of things, but now we understand that and why it happened. And I forgive my dad. I really do, because he was let down.
Ryan, could I just come in on the forgiveness thing, which is a very a great virtue. To be able to forgive is just an amazing thing, to have that capacity to forgive people. And moral injury it can be very culturally directed as well. For instance, as Leo mentioned, and we mentioned his father was Catholic. Well, you know, if you got a Christian upbringing, well, you may behave differently than somebody who hasn't to a moral injury. And I know, even from my own personal experience, as Marty said, I lost a son under terrible circumstances. He was only 29, 18 years ago. And I know what it's like, the hurt of losing somebody, and the questions you ask yourself, and the blame. And as I said, I could sit and look at a wall for 3 hours and not say anything. You go into this particular zone that's just out of this world in a way, and people are talking to you, but you're not listening to them. You're acknowledging them, but you're not really listening. So my religion in that situation pulled me through, because I have an absolute belief in my faith. So that helped me to get through a very dark period in my life and in my time. So I often think of people maybe who don't have a faith, and I feel for them if there's some way I can help them to get through this maze and this hurt that they probably feel from a particular instance. During the virus here, when it hit Australia, there was a lot of people dying in nursing homes, as there was all over the world. And about last year, for the first time, I've heard a nurse in New South Wales, they were protesting, and she mentioned the word, you keep telling us that we're burned out and that we need to take time off. She said, we've got a moral injury. She actually used the word moral injury. I thought she must have been listening to some of our podcasts, but she felt they were let down by the structure of the hospital or the people behind them. The people in higher authority, you're supposed to give more staff, more PPE gear. It didn't come. The fact that people were dying, she said, we're nurses. We know that happens. We see it happen. We're not really, in a way, confronted by that or upset by that, but it's the fact that you are letting us down and you're betraying us. That's the hurt we feel. So, and it's in first responders, we've talked to policemen, firemen, all people in different walks of life. And this thing of betrayal becomes very prominent when it comes to first responders in the police force and the fire situation. But I think our culture can often dictate how we respond and how we heal. Yeah, I just
Brian, do we want to bring in some of your guests there, or anyone to
absolutely
ask
actually
any questions?
Michael leads us
We're doing
really
all the
well,
talking, I'm thinking.
really well into this. So what we normally do, and this is, I'll kind of push those questions out this way just so that the recording remains all of us, because so that we've got consent for all of us, but I'll bring our questions into that this way, just for that manner. There actually is one that I wanted to follow up on, kind of along the lines precisely of what Michael just said there. Because one of the things we do at the ICMI is, and again, not to make a plug, but as a free, another plug for our conference in April, one of the things we want to do is kind of look at the ways in which different cultures certainly both have an impact on moral injury, the way we talk about it, the way we can name it, and certainly sometimes the way I should say, the available vocabulary culturally of things we might have to work with to name it and to talk about it. Given that all three of you share somewhat of a cultural heritage here in being Irish, not to make stereotypical statements here, but are there ways in which you see that your own cultures and your own kind of national histories even can both enable and perhaps make difficult talking about something like moral injury?
Leo.
Wow, wow, why did you stick with me with this question?
Sorry about that.
I don't know. There's something in the Irish culture when it comes to battle and so on, like in the American Army, more than 250 or 280 Irish born soldiers won the Congressional Medal of Honor more than any other nationality. And it's only put down to one reason, according to an American general. He said, the only reason I can think of is the Irish faith, the faith they have. So I'm reasonably religious. I'm more spiritual than I am religious. But I think that we can put up with a lot of things because we have a faith, because we think somebody is protecting us. I don't know. I might be talking stupidity now, but there's a certain comfort about the way we were raised. I think family is very important in Ireland, as I'm sure it's everywhere. I'm not saying we're better or worse than anybody else, but the Irish, I think, have the ability to put up with a lot. We've had to in our history. And that combined with what I think is our religion, even though it's waning a little bit with the young people, I think it helps us to cope with things like moral injury and to accept. And if while I've got the ear, there's one point I'd like to make. Marty was talking about understanding and how it heals and everything. There's a specific example. Marty and Michael know this even better than I. And I spoke about this in our parliament the other day, and I'll be speaking about this particular incident to our deputy prime minister this coming Friday on moral injury. You can imagine a 17-year-old boy in Jadotville going out under severe heavy machine gun fire to rescue the pilot and co-pilot of a crashed helicopter. And he helped them. He was recommended for the Victoria Cross equivalent, which we call the military medal for gallantry. He never got it, but that's beside the point. He emigrated to South Africa, then New Zealand, became a violent man, speaking to his wife and his daughter now is probably a grandmother, describing, a bit like Marty said, you never knew what walked in the door in his case, same in this man's case. And the daughter had no time for the father, the memory of the father, until she started hearing about moral injury from Marty and then started coming on our show. I was able to send her the number, rank, and name of everybody that was with her father in the battle, what her father did, how he's recommended for this, and this. And she described how he tried to kill the children with a pistol, a 36 Webley. But now she says, I understand why he was like he was, and she feels relaxed about her father's memory. She forgives him. She doesn't like lots of things, but she understands it. And to hear his 82-year-old wife saying, I still love him to bits because she understands it. So this gave me personally a great lift when I said to myself, wow, at least something we're doing is resonating somewhere. Sorry, that's not exactly the question you wanted to answer, but I just thought I'd throw it in.
No, thanks, Leo. Let me just say this. We've got a couple other good follow-up questions on this, but let me perhaps pose it this way, just in terms of perspective. Obviously, what we're doing here is wonderful, and I appreciate all of the ways in which we're focusing on hope and healing in this. In that, let me problematize it a touch and just ask, at the risk of painting too rosy a picture here of moral injury and the capacities, are there times where, the path to forgiveness seems like often a somewhat rocky one at the same time, and one that can be difficult. I don't want to paint it as too simple or too easy a path. Can we talk perhaps for just a moment about some of the difficulties of doing that? I mean, Marty, your story is incredible, but that couldn't have been an easy thing to do by any means.
I think you just said that is you can't rely on anyone else for forgiveness. You have to understand and forgive yourself. That's what I believe. Once you understand yourself and understand why moral injury occurred, I often think about, my sister, she had terrible beatings and stuff like that. But we realized it's like if my dad had come home after war, he would have been better if he was shot, literally. If he'd have come home and he had a leg missing or a shot, whatever, he would have got sympathy. He would have maybe, but I don't look, my attitude is I want to, when I understood moral injuries, like Leo said, the penny dropped with me completely and the family. And that's what drove me to try educate other people. But I think as Michael said, it's just listening. Even you don't have to talk, but listening. Again, I'm a talker, so that doesn't work in my family. But talking about this stuff, and it does, it comes back like a very hard thing to say, and my family were tough with it. I felt guilt because there was no one. My dad had 6 children, and no one when he died beside him. But that wasn't my guilt to carry. I shouldn't have had that guilt, but I got over that by understanding why. Because if I'd have known different, within that. So yeah, that's kind of where I am, Brian.
I think, Brian, sometimes you have to let go, and it doesn't work. It's a bit like if you're in suicide prevention. The fact is sometimes you just can't help someone not to commit suicide, and you have to accept the fact that's part of it, even though you tried your best, and not to feel guilty and beat yourself up about it. And it's the same with moral injury. I've walked a road with people, and at the end of the road, there was still, I couldn't get over the stumbling block, and I didn't try to. But, I said, I usually go with no agenda. I don't go with an agenda to someone who is suffering. I just let the cards fall where they fall. But sometimes you are disappointed, but that's unfortunately part of that. Doesn't mean you stop doing it, but to accept that as well as part of your journey, that you may be disappointed sometimes when you feel you're getting somewhere and you're not. It's just the humanness of us that happens when things happen.
Yeah, I believe if my mom had known what moral injury was, she could have diagnosed my dad, if that makes sense. But if the army would have known, they could have diagnosed him. But as I say, war came home to us. And I don't condone anything he did, but I do forgive him, not in a religious way. I was an old Dubai, but I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. Because you don't have to be, I think you don't have to be any faith to understand moral injury. It doesn't matter what it is. Any religion, its moral injury stands on its own. And once you understand that, you can get through it.
Yeah, I think you've made a really helpful point there, Marty, between certainly condoning something and forgiving it. And I think it strikes me that within different family dynamics too, that's something that, maybe something clear that needs to be talked about, in that difference, certainly between saying this is fine and we forgive this person for this. For example, I'm glad to hear that all of your siblings, you have a bond, from what you went through, that seems to provide you guys a wonderful way of speaking about it, connecting with each other, and kind of a dark humor in situations that get you through, very similar to the military in a lot of ways, in ways that we can probably relate to. But, it strikes me there might be, I can envision plenty of situations where, if you came out and you found this understanding of moral injury even, and said, this has allowed me to come, really forgive our father for this, and do that. If one of your siblings who had experienced similar, the same kind of abuse says, I can see them rounding on you and being really upset by that fact, if there's not some, conversations made about what that means for you, how can you forgive him for what he did to me? Because you've identified that the most painful parts of it were having to watch him hurt them. So, it seems like there's dynamics in which I can envision which those are difficult conversations as well, and difficult
They're
moments
difficult
at the same time.
conversations, Brian. They're difficult conversations, but look at, as I say, moral injury's got, certain people have 10%, you can get an X amount. It's like anything. Is certain, one of my family members, he does not want to talk about it. The rest of the family members are are fine with it. So it's like you got to judge it, and I don't speak out too much. I just speak what I'm seeing, and they understand it. And it's been a very healing process for all of my family, and more so, I suppose, as Leo would go with his dad. But my mum's over my shoulder all the time. You know, I like people say they feel, you know, what you talk about your dad, but talk about my mom. What the moral injury she must have had to try take our lives. Like that's the ripple effect. He was let down, but for her to do it, and as I said earlier, we joke about it when we were 6, little 9, but it wasn't. She tried to do that because she loved us so much, she wanted to take us with her. Lucky she wasn't very successful.
Yeah,
or I
and I
wouldn't
think
have been on
you're
the show today.
certainly. And I think it's really important to note there too that even within families that seemingly would experience it, the kind of the entrance of moral injury into a violent situation like that together, there's distinctive ways in which they would each experience it. That, as you say, your mom experienced it in a very particular way. You kids experienced it in a particular way. It affected each of your relationships, probably both collectively and individually with the two of them in different ways.
Correct. Yeah.
And I wonder if I can lead us then into Leo, maybe to come back to you on this too. I wonder, and just navigating some of the tensions around moral injury and certainly different experiences in the veteran communities. And I've very much experienced this in the American one as well. But I can imagine this works out in families at the same time. But there's a question about, could veterans of Jadotville be helped in a particular way about moral injury, whereas earlier veterans may have been expected to still maintain kind of a silent posture on this? And whereas, are there different expectations among different generations of military members in this? And does that kind of feed attention somewhere in here about moral injury and how we understand it?
I'm not so sure that people have got a grasp of the thing at all. Because when I was talking to the U.S. Army Veterans Associations last year over in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, they were floundering a bit to try to get people to understand what moral injury is. And some people say, moral injury, forget it. Other people dig deep into it. It's only around for about 20 years, and that's nothing in the lifetime of the military, we'll say. I'm talking about military now. And like I've met people in the nursing service in England who say, moral injury, that's what our problem is. Prison service, that's what our problem is. But I think there's an awful lot to be done yet for people to fully understand moral injury. I think in Ireland and in Australia, we're probably getting there a little bit faster, let's say, than America is. At least that's what the Americans tell me. I suppose one of the reasons is America is so big. There's a lot to cover, a lot of area to cover, a lot of people to cover, whereas in Ireland, we're small, and in Australia, it's a smaller population than America. But I think I'm just, as the thoughts come into my mind, I mentioned it when I was in America, what you need to do is try to get a champion in your village, your town, your city, your state, in one element of your government or someplace, a champion who will push moral injury. And we're lucky in Ireland. I think we've developed 1 or 2 champions now. We're talking about it. Marty's got a few people in Australia, Michael, who are well-known people in that place who are talking about it. And it's going to take something like that to keep pushing. But I think we're a long, long way from, let's say, having it on everybody's lips automatically. But we're hopeful.
On that, we had an inquiry into the army and suicide and all that last year in Australia, fairly in depth. And reading all the readings, I haven't seen the word moral injury mentioned any place in any summary of what might be causing Australian troops to commit suicide when they come home. There's more committed suicide from the Afghanistan war here in Australia than died in combat. And we have a huge problem. But I've never seen it mentioned anywhere, and even though we have spoken to some military people who have they have a good support system here, but it's for PTSD generally, or it's for welfare generally, but the word moral injury never seems to enter into it. And when you try to explain it to them, because sometimes it's difficult to understand it. It's not easy. There's a lot of ambiguity there, and what is it? Is it PSD? So they kind of walk away when they can't fully grasp it, and they say, oh yes, I see what you mean, but I know they don't see what I mean. So I think there's a lot of education, and we've done a video on the education, which Leo and Marty and myself have done, to get it out there and to give it to people. Say, just take this, and this is what we understand it to be. So education is the absolute fundamental to getting it out everywhere we can. Talk about it, get it out there, even if you don't understand. Yeah.
I think, Brian, we're running out of time, aren't we? So did you want to bring any questions in?
We got about 10 more minutes. Yeah, let me ask, because that's a great, just to follow up on that, because I think that lends to one of the questions brought up there in the chat. Just obviously our Moral Injury International and what we're doing here at the ICMI serve a common purpose too, in bringing some of these things to light. Have you encountered research or folks that you know that are looking at that experience of moral injury across generations and across different cultures? Do you know of particular things? I mean, I feel like in my experience, I know we're having a lot of these conversations and finding that that's what those resources are, the ones we're creating. But certainly, have you encountered others that you think might be helpful?
Leo, over to you.
Oh, thanks again, Marty.
You're welcome.
No, we're kind of laymen working at our level of understanding of it, and let's say feet in the mud and trying to put it at that level. I think we're reasonably successful, as I mentioned earlier. But we're aware of Rita Brock in the United States, who's got something like 3 to 6 million followers.
We had her on the show. Yeah.
We interviewed her. So people like that. People like that, and I won't use the word piggybacking, but when we do something in website, it goes then out to her 3 to 6 million people, etc., etc. So in a way, we can be, in our small little way, with the podcast we do, we're reaching 15 to 20 million people, reaching them. Not saying we have followers, but we're reaching them. This is way beyond any expectations we've had when we started this, and we didn't know how it was going to go. So we're doing it in our own way, not a very academic way, perhaps, but we're just finding our way as we go.
I don't think we do have anyone championing us at the moment, that somebody that may be high profile that can take what we've done further. We really are stuck in our own world at the moment, if I could say that, and doing our own little bit locally and as much as we can, which is great. But it would be good if some way the media or someone would take it up as some kind of a project that would take it to the world. You know what I'm trying to say? And it will eventually get there. But it's like all science and all situations. You start at the start, and it grows. And I think we are growing tremendously. And I know in my local area, my local servicemen and all that, I know what's happening, and I know that they benefit from talks and all that. But you'd love to be able to take it to the world, because that's something that we're stuck. I think we're stuck at the moment in what we're doing. But where do we go now? Where do we take this education to?
And Brian, can I just finish? You just say, if everyone can shout out to Michael. Michael's going through his own battle with cancer at the moment.
Thank you, Martin, for telling people.
Yes, and he's our dear friend, and we love him. So I'd like a shout out for him, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Anybody wants to remember me in their prayers, I would be delighted. I would love that.
Every morning and night.
Thank you very much. Very kind. Very kind.
Absolutely. Let me ask, I mean, this is a great point. We can focus on here for just a couple minutes as we start to move to a close, and then we've got one other good question I want us to talk about. I mean, I think, because from the research perspective, I'll just say one of the things that I think about a lot is the fact that, moral injury does come about in, from Jonathan Shea, who's been cited a few times,
Mm.
in a very American context. And to me, living in the UK for 5.5 years now, I can see both where it's extremely helpful to take that concept built here, bring it here, and identify the parts of it that are really relevant. But there's still it's kind of enculturated in a particular way, in a particular language, that you both have to kind of, it seems helpful to both deconstruct and then kind of put back on the different cultural trappings of the places you are. And that seems like really necessary work. And I applaud everyone here, because I think for helping to do, some of that work. But that does seem like an area where having these conversations is extremely helpful, just in hearing the resonances that work with them, and then figuring out where the work might need to be done that in their own capacities, and kind of doing that enculturated work.
Yeah. Everybody needs a friend, Brian, and I find is moral injury. Just talk to someone. Don't, as Michael always says, don't live in silence. It doesn't matter whether it's a neighbor, a friend. You don't have to go, as we say, you don't have to go to the pub or anything like that. Just have a friend, go for a walk, someone that you can talk to, and will listen. I think that's kind of what our motto is, because that certainly worked for me. And I'm privileged to have Leo and Michael as my mentors through this journey. And that's helped me big time. And I've got closure now with my mom and my dad. I have closure, which is, that's what people now, I'm gifted, as in I'm so looking forward to telling other people how it works, because it's not rocket science once you understand it.
I think when you're dealing with emotional stuff that's in the soul, in you, it's very to wrestle with that is difficult, because there's no medicine can fix it. If you emotionally fear something, or if you love someone, if it's another strong emotion, taking tablets to fix it won't fix it. You wake up the next day and you still fear something, if that's in your soul. And that's the kind of moral injury. It seeps into your soul and it eats. And I feel for Leo's father all those years. He held this about murdering rather than killing someone. Like, how did that man behaved over the years? I suggest Leo knows, but that's an example of what moral injury can do to you. But he was strong enough to survive it. Some people weren't. A lot of the Jadotville folks, they didn't. They committed suicide. So when it gets
Michael,
into the soul,
you said something very, very important there, and I'm glad you said it. Moral injury, an easy way to describe it is, moral injury is an injury to the soul, not necessarily to the mind or the heart or something like that. Post-traumatic stress is more in that area. It's an injury to your soul.
And can I just say, Leo, can I just say that when you say that an injury to the soul is also the guilt, which you always say is, we always told as kids that we'd done something wrong as transgenerational. We believed that we were guilty. That's why we lived in silence. Like, you never told anybody that your dad was beating you up or your mom was trying to kill you, because you felt you were the ones. And that's the transgeneration of moral injury. You felt you done something wrong. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was, something you did, and that ripples down the effect. Anyway, sorry, I just needed to chuck that in there. Sorry.
No, I think that's really helpful, actually, and brings us to the question that kind of our final question that was brought up, that I thought would be a good way to end, is just we've talked about this in particular ways and kind of skirted around that, but I'll ask it as directly as the question asker puts it here, and that's just simply, what might it take to then prevent the intergenerational transmission of moral injury? What, in your view, would be a way to describe that means of prevention now that you've got this sense of understanding?
Educational. exactly what you're doing as part of this podcast. Sorry, Leo, go ahead, please.
Yes, I agree, education, but be proactive instead of reactive. What's coming into the Irish Army, for example, in the last number of years is that they are preparing troops when they're going out on overseas missions. They're talking to them in advance about post-traumatic stress. They're talking to the platoon commanders and company commanders and senior NCOs. Watch for the men if they're showing any signs of this, that, or the other. Okay, so in other words, duty of care in advance of them going into combat zones. So that's how you might actually spot moral injury quickly and handle it immediately. If you can do that, then you're a winner. So I think being proactive rather than reactive, yet for people who've already been through it, as Marty says, from our point of view, it's raising the awareness, educating, and as Michael said, handing it over to people, say, look, maybe this is of use to you.
Yes, I would agree with that. If we have the support initially, and if people, especially military people, are looking at PTSD, don't ever discount the fact that a moral injury could be there and learn to recognize it. And then if you can treat that, because medicine won't fix it, therapy doesn't fix it, except maybe a listening ear might be could fix it. But unless you fix it then, at the beginning, the chances are it could be transgenerational. It's not always transgenerational. And lots of people don't suffer. They go into battle, they come home. That's the way they're made. But a lot of people do. And it's the people that do that we need to talk to. But yet, if you can nip it in the bud, to say, in the beginning by recognizing it with the people and let them talk about it, the chances are it may not transfer to the other generations because they feel they can talk about it.
And just something to pick up on from that too, would you say that bringing this up as a category of and talking about it beforehand, not just for folks going into combat, but actually families as well, bringing units in and saying, these are the kind of things you might expect. These are some things you might look for. These are ways to, as again, I'm continuing to be moved by Marty's story there, to understand, to categorize, to talk about.
Forewarned.
Yeah,
you're forewarned, you know what to expect.
But even in your own family, it's a good topic of conversation to talk about a moral injury as opposed to someone who's traumatized from a car accident or something. There may be a moral injury. You know what I mean? There could be suffering a moral injury because maybe they've killed somebody in that accident. So all this stuff, if we can just everybody talk about it.
Yeah.
And perhaps just the idea of how we process guilt and those moral emotions to actually have conversations about where we put those things, how we, what does forgiveness mean in those situations.
Before you wrap up, Brian, can I just say I've seen the guys coming over the top there. Can I say hello to all of you guys that have been involved in this lovely, important discussion and podcast today, Brian?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me use that transition to bring us to a bit of a close there then, and just say, to echo Marty, thank you all for participating in this really generative conversation with us as well. Certainly, let me thank once again Marty, Leo, and Michael for being so open and sharing, and for really bringing this wonderful conversation to us this evening. So thank you all, sincerely.
A pleasure. Thank you.
God bless you all. God bless.
Pleasure. And wish you all a good night.